So, what led you to the conclusion that the beloved disciple is Thomas?
That's a very complex question. I hope I am capable of making a clear answer. I have been working on John since 1962, and many people have said the beloved disciple is just an imaginary person. Uh, the others have said it could be Judas. Uh, there are five problems that I have observed that hinder the search for the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, that's what we have in the Gospel of John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. The five problems are as follows. The disciple whom Jesus loved is called the BD, the beloved disciple. It's an abbreviation of the disciple Jesus loved. So people say there's no BD in John. That is correct. That's an abbreviation. The second problem, people say John is a spiritual gospel and not a historical record. Since about 1950, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and with the discovery of archaeological evidence around the temple and around Jerusalem and throughout the so-called Holy Land, we have learned that John is the most historical gospel. I can give many examples of that, but maybe we could make a program on that. Is John a spiritual gospel or a historical gospel? The pendulum has shifted. We find so much history in John that we didn't know was there. The third problem in hindering people is doubting Thomas. I will try to explain to you that Thomas is not a doubter, but an inquirer, the great inquisitive student of Jesus. He asks questions, he doesn't doubt. The fourth problem is the statement, the disciple whom Jesus loved. I must say that's odd. Doesn't the tradition emphasize that Jesus loved all? Why is there a disciple whom Jesus loved? And if you said he was his favorite disciple, that also seems odd. Why would he have a favorite disciple? Does he go around with favorites? So the fourth one is a problem we cannot really get into today. It's not related to what we're doing, but it's a hindrance. The final one, the fifth problem is that people do not recognize that chapter 21 is a later addition to John, and it leads us in other directions. It is added to make it clear that John is so similar to the synoptics, when in fact people do not see that. So chapter 20 concludes John. I hope that helps us as we begin to go through these whole questions. What is the beloved disciple? Who is the beloved disciple? Now, we have just observed that the original Gospel of John covers chapters 1 through 20. And 20, as we will see, is a wonderful conclusion. Let's begin to look at Thomas. Thomas appears only once in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Only once. He appears 7 times in John. 7 times in John, if we include chapter 21, and we all know 7 is a perfect number. Maybe that's another reason chapter 21 was added, but we would be the first ones today to see that. Thomas is the hero of the Gospel of John. We mustn't miss that. Peter may be the hero of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Mark may have been the scribe of Peter, and that's what the tradition says. Now let's get going and look at 2 things at once. Let us assume that the beloved disciple is a real disciple, not a make-believe ideal person. If he is, we have to also assume he's identical to a person mentioned in John who is a disciple of Jesus. In 11:16, that is John 11:16, We hear about Thomas, who was called the 12. And he said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him." This is the first mention of Thomas. The commentators are very hard on Thomas, and they say he doesn't have any idea what he says. I think most of us would agree with me. The evangelist or the author of this section would be appalled. He saw Thomas as one that could die. He was willing to die for his master. The fourth evangelist is portraying Thomas as the ideal student of Jesus. If Jesus is to die, he is his student and willing to die also. We move then to 1323, and we find this phrase, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. That is the first mention of the beloved disciple. BD, as you know, is an abbreviation for one of the disciples whom Jesus loved. Let me read to you chapter 13, 21 through 27. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Verily, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he, the beloved disciple, asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas. He gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into Judas, and Jesus said to him, "Go, do quickly what you're going to do." It is obvious now, this is very complicated. It is obvious that Judas is going to betray Jesus. We can't ask now what betray means. We're interested in the beloved disciple. In this chapter 13, Gospel of John, it is obvious that the beloved disciple is superior to Peter, who must ask him to contact Jesus. The beloved disciple is closest to Jesus at the Last Supper. And as you know, they recline, so he's one closest to Jesus' chest. In 14:5, we have a saying of Jesus, "And you know the way to the place where I am going." Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way?" Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." You see, Thomas asked the key question. He has given the full answer. We turn now, proceeding through John, looking for Thomas and the beloved disciple. In 1926, we come across the passage, "the disciple whom he loved." The phrase no longer appears in John. I'm reading 19. "Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene." When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. What did we learn? The beloved disciple is the only male at the crucifixion. All the disciples are hiding in a room, very afraid. Now, commentators are right. The beloved disciple must be very young. He is a male, but too young to be crucified. All the others could be crucified. We're learning a lot as we move ahead. In 20, we get to the key passage. This is the last chapter of John. We have noted that Thomas is the ideal student. He does not believe the disciples. He is not doubting Thomas. He is honest and inquisitive Thomas. Observe what I'm about to read. Thomas demands criteria, and that proves he has seen Jesus die and a spear enter his side. Only the beloved disciple saw that. No other disciple is at the cross. The women are there, but the beloved disciple sees the spear enter Jesus' side. I'm reading now from chapter 20, 24 through 28, and then I'll help you understand it. But Thomas, the one who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came, with them, the disciples. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Notice the passage, "Do not doubt, but believe." Now that's according to the New Revised Standard Version. More often now, people do not use the word doubt. There's no doubting Thomas. The Greek is kai mekenu apistos, alapistos. And what does that mean? It means be not faithless. Be not faithless, but believing. The King James Version is much more accurate here. We can also say, do not be unbelieving, but believing. This is quite excellent and preserves the Greek best. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. That's another new translation, the Living Translation. And it gives us the modern idiom. It must much better. Be not faithless, but faithful. Now, I've looked up the Sinaiticus, which is the oldest New Testament in Semitic. Suffice it to say, I won't read the Syriac. And be no longer incomplete in faith. That's one translation. Another one would be, and be not lacking understanding of faith. Have understanding in faith and belief. There's no doubting Thomas. All these translations help us, even the Greek and even the oldest Semitic language, Syriac, which we know goes back to the earliest centuries, and many people thought that it was translated eventually and originally during the time of Jesus. Jesus provides what Thomas lacks, understanding in his faith. Jesus is risen. Thomas' solid questioning position, his questioning position, prepares the foundation for all subsequent belief in Jesus as the resurrected Lord. The original ending of John is chapter 20, 28. We have seen that all beliefs in Jesus that follow the first century are possible because of Thomas' questions and requests. Thomas' questions and requests prove he is the beloved disciple who saw what no other male disciple saw. He was there at the crucifixion. The beloved disciple who is Thomas grounds all our faith in Jesus in objectivity, not subjectivity. Please allow me the power of poetic imagination. If so, I can say this. One can ponder that as the beloved disciple looked up at his crucified, bleeding Lord, some blood splattered on his face and changed it. What are our conclusions? Thomas and the beloved disciple never appear in the same scene. They are most likely two names for the same person. Thomas is the hero in the concluding chapter of John. He makes the consummate confession in the most theological gospel. He offers the final confession, my Lord and my God. Thomas is the one who is a disciple whom Jesus loved, and Thomas is the hero. Why have scholars missed this? Because they hear about doubting Thomas. Thomas does not doubt. He questions claims. He's the ideal student. He knows how to ask the key question. That is, Thomas and the beloved disciple do not believe because others believe. He believes because he experiences the crucifixion as the beloved disciple, and he makes the culminating confession because he can ask for criteria. I must place my hand in his side. No one is crucified like that. And Jesus was never crucified like that, except in the Gospel of John. Maybe he was crucified with a spear in his side. All of us who follow Jesus may now also believe because of the questions and requests of Jesus' beloved disciple. He, the ideal student, watches, he listens, he observes, and then he asks the key question. The answer proves that the resurrected Lord is indeed the crucified Jesus. The Gospel of John makes that certain. Jesus is portrayed as one who loved the disciples that questioned him and learned from the great teacher. Who is a disciple whom Jesus loved according to the fourth Gospel? The beloved disciple, Thomas. He alone is present with Jesus in the climactic conclusion. He is the ideal student who teaches us how to be Jesus' disciple, the continuing emphasis in the Gospel of John. I hope this is helpful. I've learned a lot, and it took me about 60 years to figure all that out.
As you point out that Thomas, just like the beloved disciple, they both are described as having doubted Jesus, or questioning, wanting more evidence, and later both are described as having come around to believing fully in Jesus.
Yes. I think that ministers and preachers and teachers are wrong to tell people not to question. If we don't question, we won't find the answers. And if people give us the answers, they're not the answers to our questions. So we want to have people questioning, like the beloved disciple and Thomas, and develop criteria. What criteria are you using? Are you immersing yourself in this tradition? Are you trying to understand, who are you, Jesus?
Did Thomas contribute to the composition of the Gospel of John?
You know, one of the things that impresses me about you is you ask questions that no one has ever asked. Let's ponder that. The Gospel of John begins during Jesus' ministry with the signs source. The author of John inherits a source that describes Jesus's miracles of signs that he is the one from heaven. Then in the 30s, Jesus dies in 30, Easter of 30, or Passover of 30, same time. And there are a lot of sayings of Jesus. People too readily assume that when Jesus dies, there's no tradition about him. It continues. There were many people in Galilee that remembered what Jesus said. There were many people in Jerusalem. Jesus, as I understand it, was lecturing in the temple for 6 months before he was crucified. This is called oral living tradition. When did the living tradition finally die out? Papias, about 100 to 125, was convinced that we had the living oral traditions. Obviously, we don't have it now, and we don't have Papias. Yes, you're right. I've been looking for the fragments of Papias. He wrote 5 books on the sayings of Jesus. I wish we had that. Wouldn't that be unbelievable? But you're asking some wonderful questions. Beginning in Jesus' time and through the 30s and 40s, you have people compiling what Jesus said. It wasn't written down because most people believed he was coming back any moment. So you didn't have to record because he'd come back. And Peter believed that, and Paul in his early ministry, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, and finally he will come back and he will appear to us. Jesus did not come back, and that's one reason things were not written. They were waiting for him to come back. But eventually you have tracts about his miracles, about his wisdom sayings, about his miraculous teachings, his parables. All these were developed and brought together, and one of the earliest sources we know is the Gospel of John, because he knows about things that none of us knew about. And for generations up until the last 20 years, scholars said he doesn't know what he's talking about. And now we have found what he's talking about was under the earth. I'll give you one example. We could spend hours talking about how archaeology has proved the claims in the Gospel of John. He says there is a pool called Siloam, and he describes where it is. I was in Jerusalem and was called to the area. A bulldozer cleaning up a sewage pipe hit some stairs. And lo and behold, as they began to remove the dirt, they brought in the archaeologists. I was there with them on my way to Rome to lecture, and I was very much involved in it in a spectator way. And lo and behold, they found the pool of Siloam, precisely where John said it. Now, it was covered beginning in September of 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed and brought to the ground. I hope some of this is helpful. Now we're learning that John knows more about first century Jerusalem than any writer, with the exception of Josephus, who spends his life describing it. What am I saying? Is that the first edition of John must have taken place before 70. And then I did my homework and I thought, how was that possible? And Titus, who is the general controlling the Roman troops, he says to those in Jerusalem, you can come out and bring your belongings with you as long as you're no longer fighting. There had been a huge famine. Even a woman began eating her son. So obviously people wanted to get out of Jerusalem. We will focus upon the Jesus followers. You can call them Christians. There we know exactly where they were. I've climbed into their cisterns and what they left. It's in the west-south section of Old Jerusalem today. And John and his group would have taken what they had. I would say it's the first edition of John, and he would have taken it to Ephesus or somewhere else. The tradition says Ephesus, and I have no reason to contradict that. So when we look at John, which people say don't even look at it, it's about theology and about Christology. It's about a man from heaven who walks among men as a God. And I say, read John again. He collapses, exhausted, thirsty, by a well in Samaria. The humanity of Jesus is so obvious in John. What happens when Lazarus dies? Jesus cries. Jesus weeps. This is not a God marching among men. Obviously, the really human Jesus was fully, from the Christian confession, was also fully God and fully man. If you leave out the fully man, you have just the Greek Zeus. I hope some of these reflections share with you my faith and my study. The great scholars have eventually sometimes become the great believers. And that's true beginning with Augustine and the great minds that began this. Thomas, Sir Thomas, Thomas of Aquinas, Augustine, the greatest minds in the history of our world were believers that God was present to us in Jesus. That's how I like to put it. That way I can keep Jesus to be a man like you and me.
And what would you say are the other more important similarities between Thomas and the beloved disciple that also show that they're the same person?
Ability to be quiet, ability to observe, ability to ask. Obviously, the beloved disciple was standing at the cross. He then is Thomas, who makes the great confession. So you can't say Thomas alone makes the great confession. It becomes obvious he is the beloved disciple. The problem I leave with all of you is, why is there a disciple that Jesus loved? I think that is a little misleading. I've tried to figure out a way around that. Even if you said the one he loved most or his favorite, we still are left with maybe a misunderstanding of the original Greek. I am convinced Jesus didn't have favorites. If he had a favorite, it would probably be Peter. I don't know. I hope maybe somebody can call you and help me in my search. Remember, when we have 1,000 questions and answer one of them, we maybe have 10,000 questions. Education is not replacing questions with answers, but replacing questions with incredible questions. It's wonderful to be a human raising questions. And I see a lot of identity. Both the beloved disciple and Thomas are galvanized to one historical, powerful, charismatic individual, the great teacher from Nazareth, who wanders down from the hills into the hearts of all men and women today.
Why did so many of the ancient Christians and church fathers claim that John, the son of Zebedee, was actually the beloved disciple?
We'd have to go back in history and ask them. Maybe it's because John was so powerful Christologically. You can't read John and walk away and say, I don't know what he thinks. The author of John looks you in the face and says, Jesus is the Son of God. And you see it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it comes with a thunderous thunderclap and a bolt of lightning from John. That would be my answer. And also, you may have a confusion of John. You have John the Baptist, you have John the disciple, you have John the evangelist. So there are many Johns in Ephesus, and that was obviously a joke for a long while, The problem in Ephesus, there were too many Johns.
Are we told how how Jesus came to call Thomas the beloved disciple? What led him to refer to Thomas in this way?
I think I can answer that. And you're obviously aware I'm speculating and contemplating and pondering and doing my best. Because Thomas was the ideal student. He refused to believe because Peter did. And Peter was constantly confused. He refused to believe because Matthew did, or Andrew, or Philip. They seem to be, in contrast to Thomas, gullible individuals who were afraid. They went running like crazy to hide. They're going to be crucified too. Let's get out of here. And according to the chapter 21 of John, which we find very hard to understand, the disciples end up going fishing again in Galilee. And there they see the risen Lord. How could that be connected to their hiding in the upper room, the room in which they had their Last Supper? So I would think that Thomas and the beloved disciple were honest students. They wanted their own answers. They didn't want someone else's answers. And that, to me, makes them ideal individuals. Don't believe because someone else believes. Ask, think, ponder, explore. Life is full of many, many questions, far more questions than answers. To really be mature clearly means to be able to ask clear, powerful, insightful questions. I hope I'm answering your question. Please push me if there's something I haven't spoken to.
Could you respond to the claim that Judas Iscariot wrote the Gospel of John and is the beloved disciple?
Yes, indeed. Judas has been chosen. Let me try to persuade you. I'm doing something that I do not believe, but you asked me to do it. Judas was in charge of the money. That means he was one of the most powerful, beloved followers of Jesus. In the Last Supper, he's sitting beside Jesus. Peter isn't. On one side of Jesus, we have Judas. On the other side, we have the beloved disciple. And then you have Peter. Judas is a hero. He's allowed to control all the money. So when he goes out, Jesus and the evangelist are saying he's probably going out either to prepare for getting our food for Passover, or he's giving money to the poor, which means Jesus had money to give to the poor. The story goes on that he's not. He's going to betray Jesus. Now, those who think Judas is the beloved disciple, is the best disciple, say that Judas went to the high priest. How could he do that? He was the only disciple from Judea. He was a powerful man, and he knew the high priest. He said to the high priest, "My master," this is all what they say, not tradition. Those who choose Judas say, he told the high priest, "I will bring him in, and he would really like to talk to you." And the high priest says, "Oh, that's a great idea." The high priest is Caiaphas. Judas goes out with a band of men, and he brings Jesus in. He kisses Jesus, as you know, and he brings Jesus back to the high priest. Uh-oh. the good high priest, Caiaphas, is not present. He's in the temple getting ready for Passover. Who is present? Ananias. Annas. Annas is not your favorite guy. He's been high priest for 10 years, and then his powerful associates became high priest, but he's behind the scene constantly. He would not question Jesus. He would condemn Jesus. Who do you think you are? How dare you claim that you know more about God than I do? Jesus is standing there, and we are told he didn't say anything. At this point, Judas is absolutely apoplectic. He brought Jesus not to Caiaphas, the high priest who wanted to talk to him and maybe work together for the good. He brought him to Annas, the evil man. Now, how do we know there's a little truth in this? Judas goes out and hangs himself. Matthew. Judas hangs himself. We also hear that the 30 pieces of silver that Judas had received to bring Jesus in, he goes back to the priests and throws it at their feet. What are we saying? I disagree with all of this. Judas, we get a little bit of Judas in this, the historical Judas, but he is not the beloved disciple. He is the one who betrayed Jesus, but he didn't mean to. He meant to help Jesus. Often, history takes a wrong turn. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could write history in the subjunctive? What if Jesus had met Caiaphas? Remember, when he gets to Caiaphas, Caiaphas says, I find no wrong in him. And Pilate says, hey, I don't see any problem with this man. What are you talking about? So you have Caiaphas, the high priest, and you have the governor, Pilate, saying, what is this all about? So we do know that Pilate turns him over to the crowd, the mob, because the mob is about to scream horrible things, and we hear their voices, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. You ask questions, and all I can say is that on the cuff of my wrist, I'm hoping to speak clearly to what's in my heart and my mind, but you threw me a curve with that question, and I applaud you for it. I'm sure you have some others, so let's share it with our audience.
Do we know what became of Thomas after the crucifixion of Jesus?
Do we know what happened to Pilate?
I asked if we know what happened to Thomas after Jesus' crucifixion.
Thomas. I can, if you're asking as a scholar what we do know history, we know very little. But if I say to you, what is the tradition? Paul and Peter went west, but there are many, many Jews that have gone east in Adiabeni, in many of the cities to the east, including India. So the tradition is that Thomas went east, and when you go down south to the Malabar coast of India, you have the Thomas Christians today, and they believe that Thomas took the good news from God given through Jesus to them because of Thomas. Thomas, the beloved disciple.
Is there any tradition that tells us how Thomas died?
I've explored how did each of the 12 die. Some were boiled in oil. Some were crucified. Peter was crucified upside down. Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. Now you're getting to Thomas. There are various accounts of Thomas. He was martyred All of the disciples were martyred except for John, who died on Ephesus. I'm sorry, on Patmos, the island of Patmos. But I'd have to ask, is that John the apostle or one of the disciples of the disciples?
Did Thomas have anything to do with the composition of the signs source, the signs gospel?
No one has suggested that. I think what you're raising is the question of anonymity. The early traditions about Jesus, the early tracts, the pre-gospel accounts are always anonymous. And the leading scholars today argue that Matthew is anonymous. It was eventually declared that Matthew wrote it. Mark is probably not anonymous because he was a scribe of Peter. And it makes sense that Peter, when he died, the disciples and others around said, we don't have Peter to ask anymore. Would you write down an account of Jesus? Who was he? What did he do? Luke clearly was a scholar, a brilliant Greek scholar, but he was not one of the 12. And you're really asking marvelous questions. Anonymity. When you look at the books in the Bible, the latter books, they're all anonymous. If you look at the book of Isaiah, you have first Isaiah, second Isaiah, maybe third Isaiah, and the traditions. Only the first Isaiah has a name. All the others are anonymous. So anonymity is true of many and many of our writings. Who wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch? No one knows. Anonymity. And you go back to Socrates and others, he wrote nothing. Jesus wrote nothing. And then when you get to Plato, they're Plato's dialogues. Are they from Plato, or are they really what Socrates said? They're all about Socrates. So in antiquity, and if you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, everything is anonymous. We don't know who wrote. We have over 1,000 scrolls. We don't know who wrote these scrolls. Who wrote the rule of the community? Who wrote the war scroll? Who wrote the Damascus document? We don't know. I'm trying my best to answer questions. I'm not bothered by anonymity. You take Mark Twain. That's a pseudonym. That's not the name of the author.
Do we know in how many stages the Gospel of John was written before 70, or was there only one edition of John before 70?
Well, 70 is when Jerusalem was burned, and those in Jerusalem were killed. Others were taken to Rome and built the Colosseum. Others, a few, the most aristocratic, we have just learned, stayed to help control the economy in Judea, working for the Romans. We are learning so many things no one knew. I guess I got lost in answering your questions. Ask it one more time, because I'm afraid I'm not listening to it carefully enough.
Do we know if there are additional editions of the Gospel of John before 70, or was there ever only one before 70 AD?
Okay. The first edition of John had the sign source, which was by someone else, had the and that's the sign source where the miracles of Jesus are defined as signs of who he is. And it was not written by the author of John, but inherited by him. And it may be 30 or 40 years earlier, maybe 20 years earlier than the first edition of John. Then you have sayings of Jesus, that were in oral tradition, maybe never written down until you get them in the first edition of John. Then you have written sayings of Jesus. I've always wondered if Matthew was a tax collector, he was very good at keeping records. Is there any possibility that during Jesus's lectures in the temple or along the Sea of Galilee or in Capernaum or in Migdal, he wrote down things Jesus said? We have no proof, but maybe he did. You remember, you're asking questions about areas that we have very little strong historical information. If you ask me, is it possible that some of the things that were written down about Jesus were written down by Matthew? I would say yes, he is a scribe, he is a compiler, and that would have suggested others write it down. The argument against it is, why write it down? The world's coming to an end. But I'm not so sure that was the primary message of Jesus. That is what was preached and helped explain the crucifixion. We're coming to the end of the world. Now, obviously, you've heard that in your lifetime. The horrible things happening, and we hear it on TV. It's because we're coming to the end of the world. It's a kind of human knee-jerk reaction to crises. Boy, we have enough crises today. Thank you. I'm not saying anything, but I'm fascinated with your mind and your questions, and I assume they're coming from many of the people in Houston and elsewhere in Texas. And I enjoy visiting there and talking and lecturing, and I can't wait to come back and share my thoughts orally with my people again.
Do you think these earlier editions of John might have been written in Hebrew first and then later put down in Greek, or was it always in Greek? And another question I'd like to add to that is, could this be in some way connected in a categorical sense to Hebrew Matthew, an earlier version of what is supposed to be our Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew, in some sort of kind of Jerusalem school before 70 producing Gospels in Hebrew?
The followers of Jesus were very good with Aramaic. That was their main language. People can have a secondary language, but very few of Jesus' disciples were good in Greek. Now, Paul was not one of his disciples. He claimed to be, but never claimed to be one of the 12. So I go with those that the earliest records, the earliest accounts are in Aramaic. There's no doubt Jesus spoke in Aramaic. The question would be, why would anybody translate the Aramaic sayings and accounts of Jesus into Greek? It's because Aramaic was spoken primarily in Palestine, a little bit in Egypt, a little bit more in Syria and to the east. But when you go to the west, and that's where the power base was, that's where Greece was, that's where Rome was, that's where Alexandria is. And they spoke Greek. So if you're going to make the gospel intelligent, you translate it into Greek. Now, I am one of the people that says, really, there's no possible translation. When you move from one language to another, you inadvertently shift. Now, let me give you an example. There's no past, present, or future in Aramaic, Arabic, or Hebrew. There's only fulfilled and unfulfilled action. I know that's hard to understand. So when you go from Aramaic to Greek, you have to go from unfulfilled or fulfilled actions to past, present, or future. I don't think New Testament scholars are sensitive to that, because New Testament scholars do not spend decades, as I have, studying Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac, as well as Greek and Latin and other languages. I was focused on languages. My chair here in Princeton was in languages. And when I talked in the graduate school at Duke and here in Princeton, I mainly taught languages, the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls, not the theology of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Aramaic of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So my point is one right on target with you, that Jesus spoke Aramaic. The early records of Jesus were in Aramaic, a few in Hebrew, and a few in Greek. It's possible that Jesus said some things in Greek. I remember saying that in New York, and I heard a cheer. And one of the leading scholars said, finally, someone has admitted that Jesus could and did speak parables in Greek. So you have to be very careful. How do we know that this parable that we're looking at, let's say, the parable of the seed hidden secretly, how do we know it was offered in Greek? How do we know it was offered in Aramaic? How do we know that the translation from Aramaic to Greek is absolutely perfect? You see, what we're doing is you have now moved into the world of the scholar who is exploring and learning and sharing. It's a very exciting world, and it keeps you young, but also wears you out.
And my closing question, was John redacted any further after 70 but before 100 AD, or did the additional redactions take place after 100 AD?
Almost all after 100 AD, but we don't have a clock. 753 through 811 is a very late addition to John. And it wasn't a part, it's called The Woman Cut in Adultery, John 753 through 811. Chapter 21 was added much later. The logos, I would say, that is 1 through 18, the logos hymn, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. All things were created by him, and without him was nothing made that was made. I feel like I'm in second grade again when they would say, Jimmy, stand up. Can you quote the Gospel of John? This was in public school in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, where in the morning for the first half hour, we would read the New Testament because that was good English. That taught us what good English is. Now, I don't have to tell you how we have lost humanities, religion, and education throughout the United States. The computer is doing the thinking for us. I hope that many of these issues that I'm sharing with you make sense and excite everybody, and that taking seriously the Bible, whether you're a Jew or a Christian, means engaging some very exciting claims. Do we have a future? What is the future like? Is there a God? Has he given up on us? Did someone create the world and then say, the hell with it? That's the deist. That was the founders of America. Christians and Jews don't believe that today, but those who went through the Holocaust, Christians did too, don't forget, find it very difficult to find a God who is present and loving today. I do. I always point out who won World War II. Don't forget all those miracles. How was it possible that the Jews got the promised land again? Was that a miracle or just a fluke? What is going on and who is ahead of us? Each of us can answer that in our own way, and I'm not about to program thoughts, but I have a very strong conviction that the best is yet to come.
I actually do have one more additional question. You point out on page 217 that there's an opinion that states that the beloved that the gospel's connection with the apostle John, the traditions about John the Elder, and the historical and symbolical nature of the beloved disciple, if us combined by Hengel, the beloved disciple, indeed the elder John, who may have lived from 15 to 100 CE, wrote the Gospel of John, intending to recast the beloved disciple. Zebedee resembled John, the son of Zebedee. Do you think that actually took place, that he rewrote the character to resemble John instead of Thomas?
I wrote that.
It was in reference to Martin Hengel.
Oh, so that's what Martin Hengel said.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. I was finding difficult to say that I would write that way. Hengel had a different view than I do. He was one of the most brilliant German scholars, but he took all these issues quite a different way than I do. And I don't want to be one that explains him, but I don't agree with that. I thought you were quoting me.
Yeah, you were talking about him on page 217. Yeah. Okay. So in other words, you think that the beloved disciple, even in the final redaction of John, has still retained strong parallels to Thomas.
I think we see that in the Gospel of John now. It didn't cease to exist. Remember, the beloved disciple is quiet. He observes. And then Thomas asks the great question. That's possible only if you observe and think. So Thomas is possible because of the beloved disciple, and is the beloved disciple. Faithful, insightful, and able to make the great confession. That's who makes the great confession in the New Testament. It's Thomas. There's no doubting Thomas.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.